The next speaker on the second panel of this index will be Markus Allmann. He's a professor of architecture at our school at the University of Stuttgart, and he's certainly one of the most accomplished and influential teachers in design there. He's also been a founding partner of Sattler, Wappner Architekten in 1987. The company now is called allmannwappner, and he will speak about the notion experiment.
Yes, thank you for invitation and thank you for the introduction. 10 minutes. Here we go. On y va. What do we mean when we say experiment? In general, we can assume that every experiment begins with a theory used to develop various hypotheses that are subsequently tested and either confirmed or contradicted through a rigorous series of experiments. In terms of architecture, experiments usually serve as a prototypical precursor to a spatial design, structural, organizational, or even procedural principle. Experiments in this space take place at a more manageable, less risk-laden scale in an effort to judge the effectiveness and the impact of the architecture at human scale. In this short presentation, I would like to focus on what I consider to be one of modernity's greatest experiments in the truest sense of the word, and briefly outline the methodology, the results, and the illustrative value of this bold experiment. The thing. Back in those halcyon days of 1972, when society was still in the thrall of rapid technological progress, social unrest and disruption, and two competing and diametrically opposed political systems, a remarkable building went up in Paris. A building that defied the usual categories of architectural typology and was simply referred to as le truc en français, or the thing. Its unveiling unleashed a level of uproar and controversy not seen in Europe since the construction of the Eiffel Tower. The thing contains 30,400 tons of steel and reinforced concrete, measuring 166 meters long, 60 meters deep, and 47 meters high. My God, how hideous, wrote the Journal du Dimanche, a monster straight out of the King Kong universe, responded the Figaro indignantly. The headlines in Germany run with the biggest slap in the face that Lutetia has ever received, and intestinal tract or Valhalla. Others praised the provocation, insisting that a great cultural utopia had at last found its material equivalent and that it foreshadowed an entire new universe waiting to be discovered. Today, the Centre Pompidou has the highest footfall of all the buildings in Paris, a monumental work of architecture without which, despite the enormous sums of money invested each year in its maintenance and upkeep, modern Paris would be unthinkable. The experimental setup. How did this building come to be? The mission. The 1975 law governing the management of the museum states, the National Public Center for Art and Culture, bearing the name Georges Pompidou, shall favor the creation of works of art and of the mind. It shall contribute to the enrichment of the national cultural patrimony, public information and education, the diffusion of artistic creations and social communication. The location. The Beaubourg Plateau, an inner-city wasteland in the 4th arrondissement, where authorities had demolished entire blocks of apartments in the period leading up to 1936 to combat a tuberculosis epidemic raging through the tenements. As a result, the neighborhood was extremely densely populated, but also had at the same time vast underutilized vacant lots. The social demographics of the area, mainly lower to middle income, meant that the residents were precisely the target group the building was trying to inspire and galvanize. Ironically, the success of the building was ultimately what drove that very group out of the neighborhood. the initiator. Georges Pompidou, we saw François Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl from Bernhard, I think is really a good guy. Georges Pompidou was the driving force behind the project, working to lay the political groundwork for the project during his time as Prime Minister. Counter to the mission of other elitist institutions, the idea here was to make art exhibit based on various thematic links accessible to all socio-economic classes. It was, of course, a prestige project, so one with clear socially minded intentions, and Pompidou was obviously a man of style as well. The deciders. A jury of prominent cultural leaders chose the project submitted by Piano and Rogers from a pool of 681 entries. They deliberately set out to select a project with experimental character, one that radically rethinks the future. Jean Prouvé, there in the center, was the chairman of the jury. Virtually every jury at the time was, to be sure, an all-male affair. The design team. Piano and Rogers developed their concept for the project in collaboration with Happold and Rice from OF Arup, the two engineers that had encouraged the architects to enter the competition in the first place. This anti-hierarchical, interdisciplinary design approach was a total novelty at the time. At the time, they described their process as follows. Our task is to research and actively participate in a system that provides shelter, food, education, and quality of life for the have-nots, while also working to alleviate the stress, responsibility, anxiety of the haves. Later in the same text, one way to approach this challenge is to first interrogate our own lifestyles and then to harness our own creative capacity and the wide range of technological innovations available today to address the real needs of the world, end quote. The outcome. The original entry in the competition is more of a rough sketch of the project than an accurate representation of the actual structure they intend to build. That said, the model presented to the jury clearly shows the project's underlying discursive principles. They reference archigram and the hypothesis of Peter Cook, no monumentality, no permanence, architecture does not need to be, as well as Zetic Price's Fun Palace from 1964. Their understanding of the public space reflects the ideas of Henri Lefebvre and the right to the city. The original concept opens the entire ground floor to the general public. Making the spaces flexible and prioritizing lightweight construction are key characteristics of the design. Clearly evident is a rejection of exquisite forms in favor of a more industrial aesthetic, which ultimately becomes exquisite in its final build iteration by explicitly displaying the supporting and load-bearing elements and externalizing the building's technical and functional components. This cross-section provides the best vantage point to see the most radically modernist elements of the design. The constructive system takes precedence, even in the blueprints, and is an actor with the same standing as the exhibits and the users. The knot becomes a joint, stable instability and motionless movement, unconditional transparency, and all transitions abolished as a result. Architecture stripped of its clothes, only skeleton and internal organs remain. The significance. From a process point of view, the unmitigated access to the technical infrastructure, the radical transparency of the project's framing, and the willingness to take the risk of championing the unknown over the conventional are noteworthy. These are all qualities that are increasingly rare in architecture today, due in part to current production conditions. In terms of how we conceptualize spaces, the prevailing and most popular model today seems to be an effort to achieve maximum flexibility by stacking huge empty halls on top of another. What makes the design of the Pompidou so relevant for us today, however, in contrast to radically reductive geometric modernism, is the way it regards the constructive elements as primary. Whereas Gropius and Le Corbusier took every opportunity to talk about a construction, there is hardly a single constructive joint visible in any of their buildings. Their movement instead gave us clean, immaculate surfaces on the exterior envelope and volumes under the light, rather than causality and the visible logic of a structure that has been assembled piece by piece. The Centre Pompidou, with the excessive exhibitionism of its visible joints and infrastructure, with its building materials and techniques that gobble up precious resources, is by no means a direct model for today's architects. It is, however, in its conceptual approach, the basis in both form and function for contemporary architectural movements, movements that now, 40 years later, are following in its footsteps by experimenting with prefabrication and additive construction methods in response to both appropriability and the growing scarcity of resources and energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Markus Allmann, for these reflections on le truc, the thing.